Oldworld is a turn-based civ builder developed and published by Mohawk Games. It's a Civilization-style empire builder with some different touches and ideas to help differentiate it from the rest of the crowd. The chief one being that instead of just ploughing on throughout the ages as a kind of immortal deity, you are now a mortal ruler of your chosen people and must therefore contend with your family dynasty to ensure your rule goes on uninterrupted. Now I know what you're thinking when you look at the graphics. You're thinking, is this just a Civ 6 mod? And you'd be somewhat wrong and right in thinking that. Yes, this does borrow quite heavily from the Civ series, which isn't too much of a surprise when you consider that Mohawk was set up by Soren Johnson, who was the lead designer of Civilization 4. Essentially, they've tried to combine Civilization with the family intrigue and legacy mechanics of the Total War series, and layer on top a whole load of random events from the roguelike genres. It's a tricky balancing act to pull off. In particular when you consider that different elements all require different environments and mechanics to work in. The Civilization series has always spanned huge tracts of time, around 4,000 years or so, which doesn't lend itself well to having a family tree mechanic. So the game ages have been shortened to remain in the Dark to Middle Ages, so the family tree doesn't have to try to span a few millennia. This means that the progression has to be shorter, and there you run into the danger of having the game run too slowly, so it doesn't feel like it's moving forward and it gets stagnant. The random event mechanic doesn't lend itself well to prolonged gameplay either. In a traditional roguelike, the random events are there to fuck the player over, so they'll have to restart the game. Needless to say, in a game setting where you're looking at over 60 hours for a single game run through, that's not going to go over well. So the sting and the tails of the random events have to be taken out, but they have to retain an element of danger, otherwise players won't pay any attention to them and just treat them like a pop-up window. Plus, their reward element has to be balanced out as well, so that a succession of random events doesn't nerf the game for you. And I'm happy to say that Mohawk have gotten the balance down perfectly. The family drama and random events are weighted so that you barely notice the truncated timeline of the game. The graphics are also pretty good, if somewhat generic after a point. They're certainly missing a lot of the art assets from Civilization, but what's here does make for a game that looks good but is still legally distinct. The units look pretty good too, although the animations are sparse, don't always trigger, and the ones that do are, well, terrible. One of the main changes many turn-based fans will encounter is the game's mechanic of orders. In Oldworld, you have a limited amount of moves in a pool at the start of your turn, which will then have to be distributed out evenly amongst your units and various city actions. This is an interesting mechanic as it pretty much limits you to waging a war or developing your cities. Attempting to do both can get really tricky with key movements and actions having to be put off for a turn or two because the orders pool can't stretch that far. I've been getting used to it and I kinda like it. It prevents simply having more units from being the sole reason you'll win a war. It's a good mechanism to help force players to actually think about their unit actions before using them. It's definitely going to be the new twist that's going to divide fans more than any other, that's for sure. It also ties into the family mechanic, as the amount of orders you get is tied to the amount of prestige your ruler has, along with a whole host of other bonuses and penalties, depending on the ruler's actions or personality. The city development is also an area of massive change, as the cities themselves don't build their buildings. You use your builder units to construct the buildings in the city's tiles. These also consume orders, and building will incur a constant drain on orders over the course of construction, so that's another thing to take into account when you're considering development and war at the same time. Units are still produced from the cities in the same way, so not everything has changed. Which all leads me to the main downfall of Oldworld and why ultimately I can't really recommend it right now, even to die-hard Civ fans. With all the focus being on the aforementioned balancing act, it appears none was given to the rest of the game, in particular the units and combat. Look, put simply, it's pure shit. The combat has absolutely none of the feel you'll get from other turn-based games. Your units just bump off each other like disheartened chess pieces, and the ranged combat is just as bad. There's also no real indication of how well protected or exposed your units are at any time, and the terrain doesn't seem to have any impact on the outcome of the battles. The combat just doesn't seem important. It seems to almost have been an afterthought of the game. Right now, it's pretty much just a numbers game. If you've got more ranged units, you can pretty much just tear through everything you come across. It's odd. With the orders mechanic, they've got a really good device to force players to think tactically, and yet they just implement the combat in such a cack-handed way. It doesn't make any sense. Also, everything else around the units isn't very well done either. The movements don't often trigger and their animations don't seem tied to the landscape that they're on. When compared to other turn-based games, not just Civ, in those games it really does seem like the units actually occupy the game board rather than are just character models floating over the top of it. The same goes for the animations as well. They don't just feel like they're linked at all to the action that they're meant to be portraying. Unfortunately, while this game has made a great attempt to distance itself from Civ, one of the things that's adopted wholesale from Civ is an atrocious diplomacy mechanic. It's a fucking mess. The other nations don't have any continuity to their actions, openly mocking and threatening you one turn, then asking for egregious favours the next. In one of my first games, the Egyptians offered one of my scout parties a gift of food. I accepted, but then the gift turned out to be poisoned and the unit died. My next turn, they requested that I declare war on another nation just because they said so, and got angry with me when I refused. No hint of, hang on, we just used germ warfare on these guys, maybe they aren't likely to do what we say. On the whole, Oldworld presents a lot of really fantastic ideas to shake up a turn-based strategy genre that's getting more and more monochromatic. However, at the moment the implementation just isn't there to the degree I'd recommend this to all and sundry. It's trying to position itself somewhere between Total War and Civ, and it's going about it the right way. I believe it's aimed at Civ players who want to be more vested in the nation that they pick at the start in terms of personality and the deeper connection, rather than a list of particular advantages tacked onto one or more cultural figures. However, it still suffers from the same sense of disconnect between what happens turn to turn and action to action. If you like what you see, I'd recommend trying this well before you buy it.